Welcome to Bradford and Brooks with your host, Margie Bradford and Jim Brooks, live on WBRT here in downtown Bardstown. The show is sponsored by Springview Hospital in Lebanon. Thank you for listening to 97.1 FM, 1320 AM, and 94.9 FM in Lebanon. Bradford and Brooks, a civil discourse of discussion where community involvement is encouraged. Bradford and Brooks is on.
All right, good morning, Bardstown and Nelson County, and welcome to another edition of Bradford and Brooks. Jim Brooks and Margie Bradford with you again this overcast, rainy Wednesday morning. Well, good morning, Margie.
Good morning, Jim.
Well, I tell you, I'm glad it's not like last Wednesday.
Oh, yes.
When we had the real gully washer. I think I told you last week, you asked me how I got to the studio, and I said, with the backstroke. But didn't need to do that, and thankful, too, because the local governments have had quite a mess on their hands with all the
yes, they have.
Flash flooding,
right.
And then you probably...
And dangerous, too, on some of those low parts of the road.
Right, and, you never know how deep the water is, and I think
No.
On North 3rd Street in front of Conway Heaton, the water was as deep as there I've ever seen it. I mean, it was actually up
Well, it
into
did.
the-
I mean, they had rescued several people out
That's
their
right.
cars
That's
from
right.
being flooded in. So you don't think about that happening, but it does.
Right. But anyway, no, we won't have. Now, I think we're under a flood advisory. There's a possibility of some heavy rains today, but nothing like last Wednesday.
Right.
All right. Well,
Don't
Margie,
have to practice your breaststroke anymore.
That's right. Wasn't even good at it anyway. All right. Well, Margie, we have a very special studio guest with us today. Kentucky Secretary of State Michaele Adams is here in the studio with us, and we're very glad to have you today, Secretary Adams.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Glad to have you.
Very glad.
All right. Now, first, I appreciate all the support your office gives to the county clerks. Our county clerk, Nelson County Clerk, Jeanette Sidebottom, does a great job. She's got a great staff. And they have had some very, and I guess county clerks across the state in the last year or so have had really trying times with the pandemic, and not just operation of their offices, but also with so the county clerks are responsible for the elections and the primary and general election, and so there's no rule book anywhere for how to handle a pandemic or an election during a pandemic, and with guidance from your office, I think things went very well given the circumstances.
Well, I'm really proud that unlike a lot of states in our country, Kentucky had a uniquely safe, secure, and successful election. We were the first state that voted during the pandemic. Actually, that's not true. A couple states went before us. We were the first state that voted successfully in the pandemic. In Wisconsin, they had polls closed with no notice. They had problems with their absentee ballots. People were told they could vote absentee, then they changed it after the fact. There were court challenges in Ohio. The election was called off and put on and called off again. They all had messes, and ours was the first state that really got it right. And that's because we came together in a bipartisan way, worked together to set clear rules well in advance, and we stuck to those rules. And to your point, the county clerks did an amazing job.
Absolutely.
The people think I run all the elections. I don't. I'm the chief election official, but I'm not the only election official. There's also 120 clerks running this at the ground level, and they did an amazing job.
Well, I want to compliment you on the way you and your office handled it, and your cooperation with Governor Beshear
Thank you.
on this, because it made for one of the most successful elections we've had. I mean, it ran really more smoothly, as smoothly as a regular election, if not more, and afforded more people chances to vote. both by lengthening the time period and by extending the right for write-in votes.
Well, I think there's
mail-in voting.
There's one thing that we have really gotten right, not just last year, but this year that other places are missing. Other states have missed this. I think Congress has missed this too, that you can have access and security at the same time. You don't have to trade one for the other.
Absolutely.
Republicans care about security. I do too. You can still have a fair election and let people vote. And Democrats care about access, and they're right to. We all should.
Well,
but you can have some fair, simple rules to make sure voters are who they say they are, and then let them vote. And that's why we've really found the sweet spot in Kentucky.
Right. I would like to ask you one thing. What's your position on felons who have served their time and being able to vote again?
Well, I'll tell you, my position is I respect that Governor Beshear has, through executive order, granted a large, it's a blanket pardon to, I think, about 185,000 individuals. But I don't think that we should have a change in that policy every time we have a new governor. We've had, I think, 5 governors in a row, 3 Democrats and 2 Republicans, and every time there's a new governor, they change the policy. And it's very unclear for the voters. I would like to have a constitutional amendment to clarify this forever, basically. Have the legislature have a chance to vote on it, have the people have the chance to vote on it. But I think that we should restore the right to vote to those who have served their sentence and who have not reoffended and have made restitution. And we can look at some maybe particular crimes, maybe election crimes, for example. We want to have maybe a more individualized review for those folks.
Exactly.
But I think for your garden variety folks who made a mistake, I'll confess to you, my views on this subject have changed over time. I used to be against this type of approach. And then I had a cousin of mine that got in trouble with the law. She's a sweet, good person, but she got mixed up with a boyfriend, and he was into drugs, and then he put some stuff at her place, and she got dinged for contraband, and she did some time. And it changed her life. But she went out there, got a job, proved herself, and then she asked for a pardon. And we got her a pardon. But, no one should be judged by that one moment of their life where they make a mistake. There should be a chance. As a Christian, I believe in forgiveness. There should be a chance for people to get right and rejoin society.
Well, that's great. Are you going to work for that, try to get that taken care of?
I am. I think it's got a pretty good chance of passage. A lot of it's not a partisan issue. It's something that pretty much all the Democrats agree on, and a lot of the Republicans do too. It's already passed, I think, the state Senate a couple times.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I wish you luck on that.
Thank you.
Well, I think, we've had local residents call in who, in their youth, have a felony on their record. And, there's not an easy way to make that go away because it affects your life from that point forward. As far as, of course, owning a gun, voting, and so that I think if you've done the time and you've made exactly like you made restitution, there needs to be a easier process for those who understand what they did to have their rights restored.
Well, if the object is to reintegrate people into society, you don't want to put so many obstacles in their way that they can't do it and therefore remain on the fringes and outside of society. And when you're outside of society, you do things that are not legal.
Right.
That's right. And I think there is an extreme viewpoint. I don't support the notion of giving current people in prison the right to vote. That is one position that's been floated. I do think you ought to get it right first. You ought to not reoffend, pay your debt to society, and pay the people that you stole from, if that's the crime that you committed. But after that, you're one of us. You should rejoin society.
Right. I will say one thing though: when you repay, if someone has stolen quite a sum of money and have no way of paying that back, how can they do it?
Well, yeah. I mean, most of these are petty criminals. They take money out of the cash register, things like that. We're not talking about large embezzlements or for the most part.
I mean, I hope that if you do that, then you specify that kind of thing, because then you're just sort of putting a double whammy. You're saying yes, you can do it, but no, you can't.
Right.
Well, Secretary Adams, This last general election, of course, the news was filled with discussions of voter fraud, et cetera. How secure do you think Kentucky elections are? And we've heard allegations that machines were manipulated and votes were changed. Is that with the technology used today in Kentucky for voting machines? Is that a concern, or even possible, depending on, and probably varies from county to county depending on the technology they have?
Well, unfortunately, one of the parts of my job that's most necessary, but also very tiresome, is constantly responding to misinformation. There is currently a quote election integrity tour. That's what they call themselves. It's a misinformation tour that's gone around our state. They're lying to the voters of our state. They're trying to mislead them into thinking our elections are being manipulated through the internet. That's total nonsense. Our election machines cannot hook up to the internet. They don't have the capacity. They don't have the necessary technology, and there's no reason that we would want them to. Let me explain how we count votes in Kentucky. It's so old-fashioned, it's almost laughable. It's like something from Mayberry or Green Acres, but that's how we do it. People watch on television and they see that we have a website and they think that this is all being done by the internet, but it's not. This has been done for generations and it hasn't changed. Our poll workers, and by the way, we are uniquely bipartisan in Kentucky in how we run our elections. You've got a bipartisan state board of elections. You've got a bipartisan county board of elections in every county. At every precinct, you've got a bipartisan group of poll workers.
Yes, you do.
And they all have to
And they have a hard
unanimously.
time making sure to balance it out.
You know well because you've been involved in this process as well.
Right.
But at every precinct, you got to have all four of the poll workers sign off on the count. And then it goes to the county board of elections, and they all four have to personally sign off on the count. And every time it's D's and R's together. Then it comes to us in Frankfort, and D's and R's got to sign off on it too. But there are no machines plugged into the internet. These machines are totaled out. Most machines now in Kentucky count paper ballots. If we think there's something wrong with the machine, we can open the machine, pull the ballots out, and count them.
Right.
In our law that we'll talk about in just a moment, we've now made that universal across the state going
So
forward.
you will all have, every county's going to have.
Yeah, when I started, we
Thank
only...
goodness.
Yeah, no, I think whatever your politics, it's good news to have a paper ballot that you can electronically, because you get the speed of a quick count but the security of a paper trail.
Right.
If you need to audit, if you need to recount, you can't do that with electronic machines.
Exactly.
But that doesn't mean that those machines are on the internet. They're just simply not.
No,
There's no way to
exactly.
change votes through the internet.
No.
Now, Secretary Adams, you bring if I'm not mistaken, I'm thinking back about before when you were elected, you were here for the Lincoln Day dinner. You bring a background in computers and security to this job. Is that right?
Well, I bring a background in election law. I had a very successful practice for 20 years in election law. I had national clients. I was in D.C. for most of my career, and so I don't bring a computer background per se, but I bring an election background. And I was also on the State Board of Elections.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, like Margie said, we had our elections last year were amazingly smooth and good turnout.
Absolutely. And I love the idea of being able to deposit your absentee ballot in a secure box. And that just is, you don't have to worry, you don't have to depend on the mail system.
That's right.
Right. And in the general election, the early voting, a lot of people took advantage of the days before the election. I know I did. Just to,
I did too.
Yeah, it was great.
Well, it gave you the chance to be able to vote in person without having to stand in a long line. And there's a lot of us who just can't stand in a long line for various reasons.
We did that last year for public safety reasons. We wanted to avoid crowds. We wanted to promote social distancing. But what we learned is when you make it easier for people to vote, more of them vote.
Right.
In the primary, we had the first election in our history, a primary with more than 1 million votes cast. And in our general, we had the first election in our history with more than 2 million votes cast. Wow. And that's because we made it easier. And even in a pandemic, people came out to vote. So we did make early voting permanent. It's not going to be weeks and weeks. That's not really affordable, sustainable long term. But by law, now you've got a right to vote Thursday, Friday, and Saturday, as well as Tuesday election day. And interestingly, I went back and looked at this. in Kentucky's first two constitutions, we actually had by law a right to have at least 4 days to vote. Sometimes they offered even longer, but a minimum of 4 days was in the Constitution. They later changed it and said 1 day, but they gave the General Assembly authority to expand it if they wanted. They just never got around to it, just through inertia.
Yeah.
But there's nothing magical about having 1 day to vote. That's kind of silly. We'd be
Yeah.
furious if you just had 1 day to go get your driver's license renewed, or 1 day to get unemployment, or
Yeah.
whatever. People would
Right.
be really upset.
Right.
I'm in the customer service business. I think you ought to have multiple days to vote.
Right. Well, I think it certainly it in the results it paid off, and most people I know voted early. And I also like the idea that here in Nelson County we had 3 voting centers
Yeah.
rather than 20 some precincts. With
Worked out great.
and that I think that worked really well.
Right.
Because I was initially worried. Well, we've always voted in our precinct, so I had to drive a little bit further. But I think that the burden on the clerk's office, you couldn't do multi-days of voting in 20-some precincts. It's just you
Right.
couldn't sustain that. But anyway, kudos again to the clerk's office and the employment or the election folks over there who just made sure it got done. And we had drive-through voting at the Nelson County
Yes,
Fairgrounds,
right.
and that was popular. And the night of the primary, I was out there waiting and got to watch, actually, while the staff were inside signing off on all of the tapes from the machines. It was, with the media, we were standing outside waiting impatiently for the machine totals. But
Well, yeah, they also had an inside. You could also go in and vote inside.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
You didn't have to stay in your car. You
Right.
could get out and
Right.
so it worked out great.
Yes, it did.
Well, the vote centers, those are now authorized on a permanent basis. That was a temporary change we made last year
Right.
through emergency powers. It's going to be optional. If a county wants to keep all the precincts open, they certainly can. If they want to do vote centers, they can do that. They can do both. Under this bill, it'll be a local option for how they want to do it.
Good.
Depending on your county, it may or may not work. I think it works pretty well in this county.
Yeah,
If you're in
it worked.
Harlan and everyone's got mountains in between towns,
yeah.
it's a little tougher to work that
Right.
out. But
Right.
I think it'll work well for counties like this. I was in Boyle County, not too far from here recently. They're going to save about $300,000 by using the vote center model because it saves having to need as many machines and as many poll workers.
Right.
Where is this?
In Boyle County,
In
Danville.
Boyle. Oh, yeah. Okay.
Well, I think one of the concerns, and apparently it may well be a concern next year too, is poll worker safety.
Right.
And that was one reason for the change in the elections, because so many of here in Nelson County, so many of our election poll worker volunteers are people my age and older. And that was the population that most at risk from the coronavirus.
Oh, yeah.
So there were lots of reasons to make changes to how the election was run, but it did well here in Nelson County. Secretary of State, you mentioned earlier changes in the election law, and give you a chance to tell us a little bit about what's going on and what's changing.
Well, thanks. This is really important for your listeners in Washington County and counties east of there because we've got a special election on November 2nd due to the untimely passing of Senator Tom Buford. He's got 5 counties, Jessamine, Fayette, Mercer, Washington, and Garrett that will be voting on November 2nd. We also have special elections in other parts of the state due to another death and a resignation.
Right.
So I especially want your folks listening who are going to vote to know these new rules. Number 1 is the early voting. Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and then, of course, Tuesday, Election Day will be a day you can go vote in person. No excuse necessary. Just show up and vote. There may or may not be vote centers, depending on what plans we get from the locals and what ultimately we approve. My expectation is that all the counties will do that because we still will be in COVID when we're voting in about 6 weeks. We also kept the portal, the absentee ballot request portal.
Oh,
Instead
that's
of you
good.
having to go to your clerk or call
Right.
your clerk and they mail you paperwork and you fill out paperwork and you mail it back, we got rid of all that. Now you just go online at our website, sos.ky.gov, and you can click and you can apply for a ballot. You can it verifies your identity which is important, and then it also lets you track your ballot. So you can know 24/7, log on and see where your ballot is.
I think
so
that's
it's
amazing.
Super transparent.
I think that's amazing.
Also, the cure process. In prior elections, we had to throw out a lot of ballots
Right.
due to mismatches of signatures. We check every absentee ballot envelope signature against the voter registration card.
Right.
People's signatures change over time.
Sure.
Mine has. Y'all's have too, I'm sure.
Right.
Now we actually contact you and make sure that it's you before we throw out that ballot. So these are all things that we did last year,
Right.
temporarily through emergency powers that have now expired. But these are all things that both sides really liked, and we've made those permanent.
Good. That's wonderful.
Excellent. A topic that regarding elections that Margie and I have discussed is ID requirements
Yes.
for voting, and
Yeah.
and I think the Democrats are concerned that any requirement for proof of ID can be a burden on those lower economic folks or people who have no job or transportation.
Yeah.
What's the current status on how people can vote and prove their identity here in Kentucky?
Well, before I took office, we did not have a photo ID to vote law. Our neighboring states did. Purple, red, and blue states around the country have had photo ID laws. My wife is from Rhode Island. They're a very left-leaning state, but they've got a photo ID to vote law. I wanted a law. That's one of the issues I ran on, and I worked with the legislature after I was elected, and we passed a bill. But our bill is very humane. It's based on photo ID laws that have been up to the U.S. Supreme Court and been approved. There are more draconian versions of photo ID that have been struck down by judges. That's not what I wanted. I wanted a humane law that would stand up in court. And as a testament to how well-written this law was, I was sued 3 times to strike it down. We won all our lawsuits. We do require a photo ID to vote. There are limited exceptions for people who can't get a photo ID. But I can tell you in our last election, 99% of voters voted with a photo ID. The other 1% were a mix. Some were people that the poll worker knew. But now we require the poll worker to execute an oath that they know that person. We've had some abuse of that in the past where the poll worker just lets anybody in and says, oh, yeah, they're all right. You can't have that. You got to have some kind of identification.
Right.
But my concern is that they're talking about 21 locations in the state where you can get this ID. That would be, we have 120 counties. And the people that would be most affected by the difficulty in getting to those would be the poor, the elderly, the disadvantaged, the handicapped.
Well, I agree with you. That development is subsequent to our passage of the photo ID law. I have nothing to do with driver's licensing or issuance of the IDs themselves. That's the governor. That's his administration. They are the ones that have restricted access to this service. And I certainly encourage him to expand access for IDs for whatever purpose, for voting, for driving, for anything else. That's something that's on him. I hope that he'll reassess that.
I've always been a proponent, you can't go into any store without an ID to write a check. And I've always been a proponent that people need to prove who they are. What are you mentioned limited exceptions to the photo ID requirement. What can you state what those might be?
Yeah, there's a couple. One is if you know the poll worker.
Okay,
but
right.
the poll worker has to execute an oath that says, "I know this person," because we've had evidence in the past of abuse of that and potential fraud of the poll workers just letting people in without checking.
Right.
We can't have that. We got to have some kind of verification.
Sure.
But if you're in a rural county where everyone knows everybody, I don't want to require these people to have to go out and get an ID that's not necessary if they're known to the poll workers.
Right.
The other exception is what's called the reasonable impediment exception. This is something that South Carolina's law had that I borrowed. Basically, if due to your own unique life circumstances, you can't get a photo ID. Maybe you've got a religious objection to being photographed, things like that. Then you can vote with a non-photo ID if it's an approved form of non-photo ID. And there's a list in the statute. We accept non-photo IDs like a benefits card issued by the government. We had only, I think it was a few hundred people out of over 2 million people in Kentucky last year that used this exception. Pretty much everybody either votes with a photo ID, and by the way, we give the photo IDs away for free in our bill. So if you don't have one, go get one. We'll pay for it. It used to be $23. Now
Right.
it's free.
Wow.
That's a lot of money to people that don't have a lot of money.
Sure.
That is a poll tax if you don't make it free.
Absolutely.
So we appropriated funds to make it free. But if you still can't get one for whatever reason, there's an exception. But we saw a lot more of people who knew the poll worker than people who didn't know the poll worker or have a photo ID. Again, just a few hundred out of over 2 million.
All right. Well, Secretary Adams, we need to take a commercial break. You're listening to Bradford and Brooks, and our special guest today, Secretary of State Michaele Adams. We'll be back after these messages. Please stay tuned.
Welcome back to the Bradford and Brooks Show, live on WBRT 97.1 FM and 1320 AM. Also, streaming live at WBRTcountry.com.
All right, you're back with Bradford and Brooks. Jim Brooks and Margie Bradford here with you till the top of the hour. And Margie and I having a lively discussion about political matters and candidates. And we're looking forward to, I guess the opening opportunity to file as a candidate for the primary is November 3rd, I believe.
I think so.
And I think
correct.
the filing deadline, a couple of
Well, the end of
sessions
January.
was no, it's no longer the end. It's like in the first week.
First
And
Friday.
Yeah,
First Friday of
January.
January.
But it may be moved because they've got to redraw the lines for
Right.
the
For the
elections
district.
next year.
It doesn't seem like a very long period there.
Well, General Assembly spoke and wanted to move it.
All right.
I
Well,
always-
we better listen then, hadn't we?
Right. I heard the same thing, Secretary Adams, that if they have to redraw districts, we had that situation 10 years ago where the 50th district was redrawn, and anyway, we ended up having a Republican when they decided to change what they were working on. We had two Republican, a Republican newcomer facing a Republican incumbent, which never was intended initially, because they were supposed to be in separate districts. But anyway.
Well, if I could speak to this is the biggest potential crisis in our elections that we're not really talking about much outside the Capitol. We talk about it plenty in the Capitol, but
Right.
folks are already getting ready to run for office next year. Campaigns take a long time. You don't just file and then run and win. You got to prepare. You got to
Right.
work it. You got to organize. You got to raise money, and you have to make those decisions well before the election year. And folks can't make those decisions right now because they don't know what districts they're in because the lines are all about to change. For county office, not if it's county-wide, but for magistrates and
Sure.
so forth, for state representatives and state senators, for members of Congress.
Yeah.
You can't really prepare to run if you don't know if you live in the district or not. So I've asked, and we've seen others ask the governor to call a special session. We're not ready for that yet. We're still waiting for the legislators to begin their maps. I understand that there's a lot of progress made on the House map. They're still working on the Senate map and the congressional map. My hope is that we'll be ready to call a special session after the election in November. I'm going to encourage the governor to do that. It's premature at the moment, but I do want us to do it before next year starts.
Right, and I know here in Nelson County, as far as the race for magistrate goes, there's several districts where there will be no incumbent, and
Right.
so right now I'm in the 4th district in the county, but I'm close to the line on the 5th district, so I don't know what district I might end up in.
Right.
And of course that's all based on population, and of course there's not been a lot of growth out in my area, but when you get in towards Bardstown, there's been significant growth.
Yeah.
And out 245 towards Bullitt County. So,
Right.
So there's no telling how those lines might change. So, I think 10 years ago they, in redrawing the magisterial lines, they ended up moving a line that put a school board member who represented a certain district, put him outside his district. So they kind of had to do a little loop to get him back in his district, because there's always unintended
Tell me,
consequences.
gerrymandering exists?
Well, this was trying. No, it wasn't gerrymandering.
I don't know.
He just didn't want to move down the street to where the border was. All right.
I rest my case.
Well, anyway, I wasn't doing the gerrymandering.
I understand. I
Right, you can
understand,
bring
Jim.
it, take that up with
no
who was on
blame.
fiscal court 10 years ago.
I have a hard time passing up an opportunity to do a dig.
Yeah, I know. You Democrats are like that. Anyway, all right, partisan politics aside, Margie. With Secretary Adams, we have, like you said, a special election coming up, and not in our area, but adjacent to us. And and then, of course, I guess the next election we face will be the primary next year. Will there be any surprises, you think, as far as, of course, there's no predicting what the pandemic's going to do. We're hoping that things will cool off and won't be as serious an issue as it is across the state right now.
Well, I don't know, of course, what to expect next year. I certainly hope that we'll be through the pandemic fully at that point. I would love to preside over a non-pandemic election. That would be great. I've had 2 elections that were in the pandemic, and then the special that's coming up in a few weeks. I'd love to have a normal one. So I don't know really what to expect. Here's what I do expect. I think there's going to be high turnout. You're going to have all the county races on the ballot. You're going to have judicial races on the ballot. You're going to have a U.S. Senate race, congressional races, and so we're not going to have the turnout we had in 2020. It's always higher in a presidential year.
Sure.
But I think it'll be higher than it normally is because of the interesting races, and now we've made voting easier as well.
Right.
Right. I think when it's the local races really do bring out high turnout. Not as much as a presidential year, but it's usually very respectable. So the Secretary Adams, you talked about the rules regarding paper ballots. Some changes with that.
Yeah, it's interesting. Back before the 2000 election, if you remember the hanging chads and all that from Florida,
Oh, yeah.
a lot of states used paper ballots, and then there was a concern about paper ballots, and so Congress passed a bill. It gave the states a bunch of free money, and they went out and bought electronic machines. And people were pretty satisfied with those for almost 20 years or so, and now they don't trust electronic machines. I want to reiterate that our machines are not on the internet. They're not. But I'm a realist, and I want people to vote. I want them to trust our system. If they don't, they won't vote. So I feel like a paper ballot approach is preferable. When I took office, we had 29 counties that didn't have a single machine that could process a paper ballot. They were all electronic. Today, all 120 counties have at least some paper ballot capacity.
Right.
But they're not fully there. They have a mix of different types of machines. And so in this bill that I was talking about that has early voting and vote centers and so forth in it, we also have a mandate for every county to adopt paper ballot equipment. It costs the same as electronic equipment. It's not an immediate mandate. The counties have time to come into compliance. There's a grandfather clause. But I think in the next 3 years, you'll see every county have every machine, a paper ballot machine. And those are really the perfect machines because you can hold your vote in your hand and look at it and know that it's correct.
Right.
People that don't trust computers can trust their own handwriting on their own paper ballot. Plus, when you run through the machine, they count them like that.
Right.
These machines don't hook up to the web. They're not on the cloud. They just plug it on the wall. They're just counters. And if we have a concern about a machine malfunctioning or about fraud or need an audit or anything else, we can actually open up the bin and pull out the paper ballots and count them.
Right.
So it's really a perfect solution for all the concerns people have.
Right. All right. I know that I cover fiscal court for the Nelson County Gazette, and the cost of elections, and particularly when it comes time to replace machines, can be pretty substantial. And is that cost borne by the county in general or by the county clerk's office?
Well, it's kind of a mix. So by law, it's a county expense. The counties choose the equipment. I don't choose it. But we do have funds available. Number one, I've asked for and gotten about $12.5 million in federal funds for our local governments to be able to upgrade their equipment. That's how we were able to achieve most of these upgrades.
So that's available to every local government?
It is in theory, but the bad news is $12.5 million is not enough to meet all the needs. It would take about $60 million to upgrade the whole state's equipment. So that's, of course, just a fraction of what it would take. I am going to ask our legislature to add additional funds to make these available to the counties. We do have kind of a first-come, first-serve pot of money left over of about $2 million from last year. Lewis County in northeastern Kentucky, they actually were the first in line. We just spent $60,000 funding them to upgrade their equipment. And so we've encouraged other counties to do the same.
Well, now, the bill that you're talking about, is that is for the next session of the legislature? Are you trying to get a special session for that, or what?
No, not a special session. This is just kind of a standard appropriation, and I don't want to ask the governor to call them in just for this. They just passed a budget a few months ago.
So you're going to, so it's for the next session?
Right, in the next session.
Next regular session.
That's exactly right.
Okay.
And the counties, they can wait until then. They can get a low-interest loan, and then.
Right.
But I want to start the conversation now to hope that we will. Voters want this. I get tons of feedback from constituents, and I think the clerks do too. This is something the public want. They're willing to pay for if necessary. But to the degree we can draw down federal funds or state funds and save the county's money, we should. A quick point on this: there is a law in our statutes that says that every county by law is supposed to get 25 cents per registered voter. That law was written in 1984 when I was 8 years old, and a Mustang cost $8,000. Now that costs around $30,000. That law's never been adjusted for inflation. And many times the State Board of Elections, no fault of their own, they don't get enough money from the state, and they actually the state suspends that law, and they appropriate even a lesser amount of money than 25 cents a voter. So it is the job of the counties to pay for this, but they haven't really gotten their fair share that they're supposed to get by law.
Right.
So I really want the feds to help, but I really want the state to help as well.
Right.
Well, I mean, you're trying to improve election security and safety, and I think that's certainly commendable. In a way, though, I will tell you, when I first began voting way back, I kind of missed the big metal machines with all the little levers, and because when you voted, you heard that kerchung.
You did.
You voted, but
they were really monsters.
Yeah, they were.
Yeah.
The old lever machines, I did a tour of a election technology company recently. They had some of those on as displays, and they're dinosaurs. They weigh about 850 pounds. And that's the biggest problem with them, is just the transportation.
Sure.
There's no way we could have a modern election with all the precincts we have with those big centers.
No, but I do that I always kind of miss that. I'll tell you, the first time I voted, I was intimidated by the size of these things. And
you thought he was going to attack you or something.
Well, I'm a big sci-fi fan. And anything that big usually had, was a robot or something that was going to swallow the earth.
Well, I'd like to touch on this real fast, why we have election machines. I get this question a lot. Why don't we just count the ballots by hand? Well, we used to count them by hand until 1940. There was so much fraud and corruption in hand counting that the state, the legislature, and the public in their own voting voted to change the Constitution to move us away from hand counts to voting machines. And so part of this misinformation tour, they're calling for hand-counted paper ballots. If you did that, number one, it would take literally weeks to count the ballots.
Yeah,
we wouldn't have results on election night.
Right.
You'd be having to hand-count millions of ballots. It would take weeks.
And there's more room for mistakes.
There's room for mistakes, and there's room for fraud.
Yeah.
And that's why we don't do it that way anymore, and we haven't for 80 years. It's a very terrible idea.
Right.
I wasn't aware that they counted by hand up until 1940, you say?
Yeah.
Well,
technology.
how else would they do it?
Yeah.
I mean, there really wasn't the technology.
There wasn't even a secret ballot in our state until 1891. So before that, you had to go into a room and you had to say publicly who you were voting for. Think about that. So there was no need for ballots in the first place. It was just by voice vote. For obvious reasons, that wasn't a good idea either. But in that 30-year or 40-year, 50-year interim, you had so much fraud in the counting.
Right.
that
they had to move away from it, and I hope we never do again.
Right. And then they came up with the 850-pound machines for voting.
They served their purpose.
Well, yes, they did. Yes, they did. But anyway, our elections, I would say, and you can chime in on this, are probably safer and more secure now than ever.
Well, I got a lot of pushback last year on all the supposed vote fraud we were going to have if we made it easier for people to vote. It just didn't pan out. We only had one instance. Out of 3 million plus votes being cast, we had one instance of an individual who tried to vote twice. Well, we catch stuff like that. We have technology built in where we know about it. This gentleman, this was in Western Kentucky, he asked for an absentee ballot. He mailed it in. He went to vote in person, and before that vote arrived in the mail, he voted in person. Well, we caught the absentee ballot. We had a record that he had voted in person, and we didn't count that ballot. Then we referred him for prosecution to the grand jury. But that's the only attempt that we saw last year. We had fewer irregularities reported last year than we did in prior years before we changed the rules and made voting easier.
Yeah, I mean that's why when I've heard people talk about the ballot, I said you can't do it. You're recorded when you're voted. It's recorded electronically. You can't put in somebody else's. You can't put that vote in twice.
Well, there are states that did have vote fraud, people voting in the names of dead people and things like that. So there are avenues, but you can keep a lid on this and monitor it and make people feel like it's transparent.
Sure.
Well, to your point, when I was in journalism school many years ago, our public affairs professor told us to, after every election, compare the voting rolls with the number the names in our obituaries for the year to see how, if anybody who's deceased actually cast a vote. But that would be harder to do today than ever. I'll
tell you this, that's a big issue that I ran on, was getting our voter rolls into compliance. We've taken off more dead voters than added live voters in about half the months I've been in office. We took off 10,000 dead voters just last month, about over 100,000 total. And that makes a big difference in people's confidence in the system.
Right. All right. Well, Secretary Adams, we're getting down to the wire. Anything else you'd like to share with our listeners before we let you go?
This is maybe the most important thing I can say is if you want to have accurate information about how our elections work, call our office, but you don't have to trust us. If you don't want to, you can call your clerk or call someone you know that's a poll worker or call someone that you know is on the State Board of Elections or the County Board of Elections. Unfortunately, there's a vacuum of people who don't trust the government. They don't trust public officials. Well, hopefully you trust your clerk. You know your clerk. You go to Kroger with your clerk. You go to church with your clerk. You maybe went to high school with your clerk. Talk to someone local. If you don't trust Frankfurt, okay, trust someone local. But make sure it's an authority figure who knows what she's talking about versus just some anonymous profile on the web.
Right. Well, I think we all run into information on social media, and that can come across as from a knowledgeable authority that may or may not be based in fact, and that kind of noise really can lead people astray.
Well, you had said earlier about there was some people spreading misinformation about the voting.
That's right, and this I'm not blaming this all on a foreign plot, but we know for a fact that Russia has intervened in our elections, but not by hacking the machines. What they do is they have bots that retweet crazy things that our own people in our own country say that dissuade people from voting. They misinform them about the days or the hours of the voting. They misinform about the safety of the system, the security of the system, to try to create discord in our country. That's how Russia has influenced our elections.
Undermine the public's confidence.
That's exactly right.
All right. Secretary Adams, we got about a minute and a half. What would you say that, and I hear this just about every election, because I will ask people I run into, do you plan to vote? And a lot of times it doesn't matter. My vote doesn't count. It doesn't matter. How would you respond to a voter who?
I'd say it does matter, and I'll give you some specific situations. You think about, I vote for president, 100 million people vote for president, so what? Well, that's not the only election.
Right.
Maybe your vote doesn't change who wins the presidency, but it can change who wins a school board race or who wins a county judge race or a state rep race. And those people actually have a lot more impact on your life than who the president is.
Right.
In 2018, we had 6 House races in our state that were decided by 25 votes or fewer. We had one that was a tie. We had one that was 5 votes. We had one that was 6 votes.
Yeah.
Those races were super close. And those races determined whether or not Republicans would have a supermajority in the state house. That's an important outcome one way or the other. So your vote really does count. And don't focus so much on the national stuff. Maybe look at your local stuff. Those are the people that have far more impact on your life, and your vote really impacts those races.
All right. Well, very good. That and we, of course, Margie and I have seen that time and time again in election results here. Some very close races. All right. Well, thank you, Secretary Adams, for coming down and being with us today. That's going to do it for Bradford and Brooks. Everybody have a great week, and we'll see you next Wednesday back here on WBRT for another Bradford and Brooks. Take care, everybody.
Bardstown, 1320 AM and 97.1 FM, your #1 radio station.